Replace your print servers with a secure cloud solution that scales with you. You'll automate print management, get scalability and flexibility, as well as complete control with visibility into all your print processes. Start a free 30-day trial by going to printerlogic.com/packet pushers.
I'm Johna Johnson, CEO of Nemertes, here with my co-host,
John Burke, CTO.
And you are listening to Heavy Strategy, the show that tries to ask the right questions, not give the right answers. And on today's show, we decided to focus on the gap between architecture and execution. We spend all this time talking about strategy and architecture. Heck, that's what the show is about, heavy strategy. But in the real world, anything that you can envision, an architecture is always perfect, a strategy is always perfect, and the execution is always imperfect. And so what we really want to talk about today is when and how not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So, John, I wanted to kind of ask you, in your experience as an architect, how do you get from that perfect architecture to the actual imperfect production deployment on time? And more specifically, what are some of the challenges that you've seen as an architect in this, architecture execution tension?
Oh, all sorts of challenges in place. But starting with the question, when does this happen? It happens as soon as you try and actually make the architecture into a real thing, because you're never actually, or almost never, deploying into a completely green field. You're almost always in an enterprise situation deploying into a brown field of one sort or another. And if it's not literally an architectural brownfield where you're integrating a new solution with a bunch of existing old solutions, it's a procedural and human resources brownfield, because you're doing it with the staff that you have and in the organization that exists. So everything always starts to go astray as soon as it moves from the sketching application into actual project tasks and execution on those tasks. And across my career, certainly reaching back past the time when I was an architect and was involved in other capacities, including strategic planning and all the execution side of things, have seen kind of the gamut of problems ranging from the solution that was acquired not only didn't work exactly as it was supposed to, but was actually incapable of meeting the needs for which it was deployed. So it not only didn't work exactly as said, it just flat out didn't work for our use cases. So that was an extreme example.
Well, can you give a more specific example?
Oh, sure. So we were trying to replace the central switching in our network, the central switching in the campus network. So this is the switches into which all the other buildings' main switches fed. And so it was the nerve hub of the entire campus network. And we had a switch from a company that had basically gone bankrupt. And
cough, cough, Nortel, cough, cough.
And we're replacing it with one from an underdog that had a very strong advocate on the staff.
Cough, cough, Cabletron, cough, cough.
Our head of networking. And unfortunately, the switch, when we brought it in and plugged it in and started testing it, just didn't do things that the documentation said it would, when tested under load, and things that the sales engineers had said it absolutely would. It just couldn't do the job. And it was getting overwhelmed with just the test traffic, which was, fractional compared to the real traffic that would have been going across it. The timeline for software fixes, and we were assured it was all software, were, in the months range. And we had only days in which to make this transition. We just couldn't wait that long, because then we would be in the middle of a semester and not in a place where we could tamper with the nerve center of the operation. So we wound up having to buy a Cisco and plug it in, which got the job done, even though it did not make us happy.
Yeah, and certainly I'm sure you paid through the nose for that privilege, because anytime you're buying something out of desperation, your salesperson can sense it and will take advantage.
Oh, yes.
And you were talking about the whole issue of features that are not performing as documented. Did you run into any other situations where that happened?
The one major one that sticks out in my head was this one time we were working with a great big shiny new storage array from EMC or EMCC, I guess. And it was just a gorgeous thing and was in most ways working as we expected as a giant RAID array with huge amounts of redundancy. But there was something we were trying to do that we just happened randomly to pick the wrong disk in the array to try it on. And when we did, the whole array crashed and couldn't reboot itself until we'd reformatted. And the fact was that there was what EMC graciously called an undocumented feature that meant that one specific disk in the array couldn't be used in the same way that all the rest of the disks in the array could, but it was nowhere mentioned in any of the documentation that it needed to be treated specially in any way. So that lost us a weekend, a crucial weekend of work as we headed into a new semester. But we did manage to recover from that one in time just by changing our plans as opposed to having to swap out the platform.
Yeah, that sounds like it was a whole lot of fun. Not.
It was a very expensive learning experience.
Well, and I know this is going to sound easy for me to say, but with my experience in testing, one of the big things that I've always encouraged teams to do is both build in time for testing and select the features that are mission critical that have to be tested. In other words, one of the big reasons that people often don't test is it takes too long. And if you're told you need to get something up and running and you've got 6 weeks to do it, you look at that and say, I have no freaking time to test. Well, yes, but you certainly don't have any freaking time to discover that your thing doesn't work. So as an architect, one of the best things you can do is once you've said the switch needs to do XYZ PDQ and our new switch claims that it does, nonetheless, we will test PD and Q and nothing else. We're not going to run a comprehensive test, but we have to figure out what those mission critical capabilities are and budget some time to test those things. Now, that said, that's easier said than done. I know in a lot of cases, everybody's going to be listening to this, rolling their eyes going, oh my God, Johna, sure.
I just did.
Yeah, that's, but basically when you realize your choices are discover that the thing doesn't work, a non-zero possibility that the thing that really matters doesn't work versus devoting, even if it's an hour, a couple of days, somewhere in there in the schedule to testing it, sometimes you're better off doing the testing.
As often as you can, yeah. And as far in advance as you can, so you have time to change directions if changing directions is required. And I'd expand on what you said to say, don't just look at the mission critical things that you're planning on doing. Look at everything you're planning on doing on that box.
No. I'm pushing you back.
Let me finish my sentence because that thing that we were trying to do on the EMC wasn't mission critical, but it crashed the box. If you're going to do it in production, you really ought to test it before you go into production.
Yeah, but see, that's where you get into the perfect and the good. If I were sitting there in the room debating this with you and I said, listen, as the architect, I think these key features need to be tested. And you say, oh, no, let's test everything. That's the point at which I'd say, dude, testing is going to take you the full 6 weeks. It's not going to work. You can either test the minimal things and keep your production schedule or blow up your production schedule doing testing. Yes, it wouldn't have caught the EMC error, but it would have caught the Cabletron thing.
Sure.
And that's the problem.
The other one blew up too. If you had turned on all the things that you meant to turn on and then seen if the box performed, we would have known before we tried to do it that it wasn't going to work that way, and we wouldn't have had production data on there that we had to restore from backup, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, so, but again, we're back in the if you knew it would all work perfectly or would fail in such a way that's great. I think sometimes if you could just sort of take a bite-sized sample and say this is what we're going to test, it's more likely that it gets built into the schedule. And building some testing in is better than building no testing in, is really my point.
I think, yes, build testing in, and B, prioritize your testing, certainly mission critical at the top and working your way down through everything you plan on doing in production. Typically, there's going to be, volumes of features you don't touch and you don't care about. But if it's something that you're actually intending to do in production, it's an awfully good idea to test it.
Fair enough. So I guess you could say there's, three categories of capabilities. One is, things that are mission critical. Two is things that aren't mission critical, but you plan to do. And three is everything else. And you would test them in those priorities and allocate your time wisely is all I would say.
Yes, agreed.
And again, realistically, a lot of times people will balk at this and balk at the need for it. But at least if you go into any project with the mindset that, hey, it's actually possible that what the product is supposed to do isn't what they said it would do, or what the product does is not what they said it would do, it's worth carving out that time to do the testing. What are some of the other challenges you've run into?
Well, one of my favorites was the time we were redoing the power and network cabling in our data center. And we had arranged for a day when we could basically shut everything down so we could, pull up all the floor panels and rearrange ductwork and everything. And in the course of doing it, actually discovered a server underneath the floor panels in our data center, one that nobody remembered existing. Even the person who, as it turned out, actually put it there under the floorboards. He had done floor panels. He had done it long enough ago that he had forgotten it was there, and nobody else knew it was there. It wasn't on any of our lists of stuff. We did eventually discover that it was in the DNS tables, but without knowing that it existed and being able to get its IP address using the sniffer, we would never have backtraced it that far. And that's where we found the note from the person who put it under the floor saying, I'm putting this under the floor.
Just out of curiosity, John, why did he put it under the floor?
It was out of the way.
Yes, I guess that's correct.
At the time that he did it, he had very limited rack and console space, and it was not something that he really needed console access to. And so he tucked it under the floorboards and forgot about it within about a year and a half. It is, I think, one of those things that people in recent generations may not get, but that was a server that ran without rebooting, except when the whole data center lost power because, squirrels like power transformers. Except for when it powered down, because everything was powered down, it was up and running continuously. The longest time was at least 2.5 years without a reboot. And that was the glory of DEC VMS. That system
there you go.
Never crashed.
I have to say, I am a huge DEC VMS fan. And enough said. But yes. Well, and I think one of the things when we were talking about this issue was that, the first casualty of production deployment is often the architecture, because in the need to push ahead quickly to meet deadlines, you end up just not being able to do exactly what the architecture is. And how do you handle that?
Nimbly, because you don't get to stop and start over, because it turns out that the new system you're putting in needs to talk to 8 things instead of 6. You just have to figure out on the fly how to get it to talk to those other 2 things that people hadn't been planning on because they'd forgotten they existed or never knew they existed in the first place. And that often happens, that the person who's making the architecture up doesn't know what's actually in the environment because it's never fully been documented. It's been getting tweaked. It's been getting or going through, evolutionary change and updates. And, a new system comes in, but it only replaces 85% of what the old system did. So the old system is still hanging around out there, serving that other 15%. So things like that happen all the time. And the folks who are doing the deployment, the engineering and wrestling with reality, actually, they need to feed information back to the architects to let them know this is going on. Hopefully the architects will still have time in their schedules to update the plans and, keep things at least roughly in alignment between the architecture and reality. until the point when the system is actually in production, after which the architects typically pay no attention to it anymore for a good bit, except as a box on the architecture diagram for some other system that they're thinking about deploying.
Streamline your IT infrastructure by switching to a cloud-native print solution. You'll reduce infrastructure by eliminating print servers, get front-end and back-end print management. You'll be bridging the gap between automation, document management, and print. You'll secure your data end-to-end with native integrations and enjoy a zero-trust-enabled environment. Start a free 30-day trial by going to printerlogic.com/packet pushers. Oh, it also integrates easily with EMR and ERP solutions. Plus, a simplified scanning solution is included. You can automate capabilities, create no-code forms and workflows in the same admin account, have full visibility, and reduce print tickets by 90%. Start that free 30-day trial by going to printerlogic.com/packet pushers.
Well, and I think keeping the sort of paper documentation up to date with the reality is important. But I think there's another challenge implicit in what you were saying, which is oftentimes, and all of us fall victim to this, oftentimes somebody who has an architectural bent of mind is trying to solve not just the problem at hand, but 3 or 4 problems that we can see coming down in the future.
Sure.
Knowing the way that something's going to be used, we know that this is going to be an issue. So, my classic example is very simple, but it's like never put actual data someplace when a link to the data could work, because you destroy the possibility of the existence of a canonical data source. And it's very, very difficult it's easy to say and difficult to do. But one of the things that I've found is helpful sometimes is if you're in a situation where, for tactical reasons, you have to do something that you know is architecturally wrong, you can actually get everybody in the group to acknowledge that the correct thing is always have a link to the data, and acknowledge that in this particular case, we're going to cut and paste the data for now, because our bigger goal is getting the system operational in 60 days, and that we will, at that point, launch a remediation effort to replace that cut and paste with an actual link or whatever it is. I'm just using an example. So basically the thing to do is to have everybody agree, number one, that the architecture is correct and the strategy is correct and the philosophy is correct. Number two, to agree that because of practical constraints, we are choosing not to do the correct thing at this time. And number three, have an actual concrete plan for remediating whatever it was downstream. And of course, we all run the risk that everybody says yes, yes, no, yes, and then never does the remediation. And you end up with technical debt. But if you document that, at least it was known technical debt, which is better than unknown technical debt.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not that people don't want to do that. Oftentimes, it's just that they get yanked into the next thing right away. And that remediation phase that they'd planned on to clean up the loose ends is essentially paved over with the next tight timeline that barely has room in it for testing, let alone going back and fixing stuff in the old system. Yes, I think that's inevitable. I'm sorry. I think it's inevitable that people will run into things where they have to do a workaround like that, and should, as you're saying, commit to fixing it as soon as possible after delivering the system in production. I would just throw up the red flag that this is how you often wind up with administrator passwords in text files that are sitting in configuration directories somewhere or compiled into the code and discoverable. This is like where half the OWASP top 10 come from if you're in a development organization, and a whole raft of other kinds of security problems crop up if you're deploying into a production environment rather than developing software. So I just want to come in and say, yes, but keep in mind that what kinds of things you do that workaround for make a big difference. And you should not be doing workarounds like that for things like administration credentials. That's a thing where you need to deal with your stuff in real time, not come back and fix it up later. If it's some kind of data file where it's not that, then yes, I think you're in a good place to punt and come back and fix it later.
I would agree with you up to a point. I don't agree with your initial statement. I do agree that certain security things should not be left. So let's agree to agree on that. But I don't think that this is, when you said this is how you end up with these unresolved technical debt issues. I don't think it is, actually. I think the way we end up with technical debt is when somebody takes a shortcut and doesn't document and doesn't flag it and knows that it's a shortcut, but kind of cringes and does it under the radar. And I think there's value to bringing it above the radar and having everybody in the room look at each other and go, we agree that X is the right path, and we are deliberately taking not X as a workaround, with the understanding that we will take time and effort to remediate not X going forward. Yes, 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 we all buy into this. Okay, team, let's go. I don't think that usually happens in most organizations. I've only seen it happen where there's an explicit goal to do that. And I think there's value to doing it that way because A, it increases the likelihood, although it doesn't guarantee that the workaround will actually get fixed. And B, much more important, it tends to eliminate or greatly reduce the quiet loathing of architecture and standards, because essentially there are an awful lot of people in engineering who really just want to go by heuristics and do what works and don't want to be following general principles, and think that people that waste their time architecting and developing general principles are in fact wasting their time and the company's time. And it would be much better to just, do what works. And so those people, by having to acknowledge that there's actual value in doing the right thing the right way for the right reasons, but getting their way to do the fast and dirty thing, actually grow as engineers, I would say.
I agree with that fully. I don't think that's at odds with thinking that this is a source of technical debt. And I think that, as you said, it's nice that it's known technical debt, because the unknown stuff is what often bites you in the butt. One of the big sources of the need to do this, one of the big aspects of brownfield operations that makes architecture such a dicey proposition, is that need to accommodate the exceptional system or the exceptional data feed or the exceptional protocol, and maintaining that kind of backwards compatibility through generation after generation of succeeding deployment becomes sort of a built-in guaranteed architecture breaker, because your architects don't want to dig deeply into the existing infrastructure and see what the exceptions are to the general rules under which the place operates. So, I don't know, back in the 90s, it would have been, but my network's all TCP IP now. And your architects wanted to draw all their diagrams just as a TCP network and not acknowledge the fact that there was still like one branch that was doing, I don't know, NetWare, and another branch that was doing Apple Talk, and another branch that still had DECnet running. And all those things would mess up the nice clean diagrams. But if Joe Schmo in the networking group just came into the job and looked at the nice network diagrams and all the IP addresses and everything, and didn't have lines and arrows and DECnet address numbers and things by which to tell that there were all these clusters of other stuff still out there, might get the wrong software or update an operating system to a version that no longer was backwards compatible with having those things on the network at the same time. So I think it's really crucial to keep an eye on backwards compatibility, not just as a positive thing that lets you keep using old stuff, but also as a negative thing that keeps you in the business of constantly needing to annotate your architectural diagrams with exceptions, with footnotes, with asterisks, with caveats.
Well, and I think it is important also to have like a meaningful conversation about when not to maintain things.
Oh, yeah.
It's, in fact, I was just on a call earlier today where the purpose of the call was how to make a thing better. And my question was, should we be doing the thing at all? And the conclusion was, no, we should do something else that coincidentally took less work and had greater demonstrated results. So that conversation, you should always be open to that conversation and not treat things like sacred cows simply because some user somewhere at some point in time wanted it. if there's some exception that is really wreaking havoc with doing things the right way, always push back. You can accommodate if it's something where, the CEO says, I must have this, have this configuration in my home office and nothing else will do. Okay, fine. But at some point you can sort of say, look, here's the cost for doing things that way. And are you sure you still feel that strongly? Maybe the CEO has changed, or maybe there's a different CEO and, it's no longer an issue. So I think there's a tendency in most organizations to sort of sustain things that shouldn't be sustained. And regular vigorous weeding of capabilities and exceptions is always a good thing.
Especially
John,
when you can attach dollar signs to the cost of the exception. Yeah.
Exactly. And John, I just want to tell you something very funny. I quickly looked back in our history and I realized it's been almost exactly a year since we did our first heavy strategy on technical debt. October 10th, 23 to October 8th, 24. And I'm like, I guess it must be, autumn, the trees change color, the wind blows colder, and our thoughts turn to technical debt. Right. So any other thoughts you have about some of the challenges in turning the perfect architecture, the perfect strategy into an imperfect execution?
Just that it's inevitable. So don't fret overly about the fact that it's going to happen. Try and minimize the degree to which it happens and focus it into areas where you can best deal with it. So exceptions that don't require you to entirely rethink how you're approaching stuff, that's okay. You can deal with it. Exceptions that you can treat as temporary and know that you'll have the at least human resources to deal with later on. Okay, go for it.
Well, and I would just say you're veering a little into the answering the questions instead of asking them. So I'd toss out there a few questions you might want to ask yourself and whoever is setting the project. Things like, do we have time or can we make time to test solutions that we have selected?
What else is going to fall off the table when you make time
Right.
to deploy something properly? Because something else will fall off the table. You are not running a staff that has lots of extra time on its hands.
Yep. What else? What are we going to not do in order to get this thing done? Another question is, what is the likelihood that we're going to discover some brownfield stuff that's going to cause problems, and where might it come from? Now I don't know that anyone could predict finding a server under the floorboards, but there are some
that was my favorite.
There are some things you can probably smell that, like, oh, this is just going to be a hairball, and bringing it out to the table at the very beginning of the conversation might make sense. You might want to ask about that. I would also say you might want to ask about the skill sets and, does our existing team have the skills to handle both our new as well as our existing scenario? And if not, where are we getting those skills?
Both as a group and individually, because what you don't want is for your big project to rely on the skill set of a single person on your team, because then if that person wins the lottery and moves to a castle in Corsica, you're up a creek without a paddle. Ask yourself about the skill levels of your entire team and their abilities, not just in any individual package, but across the set of skills that are required for this project to succeed. Yeah.
And I would say also ask yourself two other questions. What are the most critical capabilities so you can prioritize testing? So if you have, if you're lucky enough to have infinite time for testing, gosh, you're lucky. But like most of us don't. So ask yourselves early and often what the critical capabilities are and what the capabilities are that you might use so that you can kind of figure out how to prioritize testing. And I think kind of a last question to ask is, what's driving the time frame for this project and what might make it change? So for example, if somebody says you've got 3 months to do something, is that 3 months because someone wants to get their bonus before the year is out? Or is it 3 months because there's some other incredibly important project that depends on your project being successful? Is it 3 months because that's what someone somewhere decided it ought to take you? And all of those, none of those is a right answer. All of those is an answer. And that should drive how you decide what is critical and what can be allowed to derail the project and what can't. So, yeah,
and ask yourself too what things that you're folding into your actual deployment have an expiration date on them. Sometimes we're still building our deployment networks around equipment that's going to go end of life during the production window of the new thing that we're deploying on top of it. Keep an eye on stuff like that, because if you've got to pull the plumbing out at the same time you're building the new room off the back of the house, you might find yourself with a great new room that has no plumbing in it because at the last minute that went toes up.
Yeah. So these are all great questions to ask yourselves. And also, I would say the biggest question of all is ask yourself how big a gap between actual and imagined you're willing to tolerate. It's great to have all these pretty pictures on PowerPoint. We all know we live in the real world. How big can that gap be without you and your team and your organization getting heartburn over it? So another good question. There's, again, no right answer, just a good question to ask. So with that, thank you for joining us today. If you've got feedback or a follow-up for us on this topic or any other topic, send us a message at packetpushers.net/FU. The FU is for follow-up. We'd love to hear from you about your own experiences and opinions. And certainly, if you've got good stories to tell about servers under floorboards, we want to hear them. Also at packetpushers.net, you'll find the Network Break podcast, which helps you stay current on the latest tech news and what it means, and a whole lot more other tech and networking podcasts, newsletters, a job board, a Slack channel, all sorts of fun stuff. If you want to talk to us directly, you can reach us at nemertes.com. That's N like Nancy, E-M like Mary, E-R-T like Thomas, E-S.com, nemertes.com. We look forward to hearing from you.